Good afternoon. My name is Carolyn Beckford, and I am the Gale trainer. Today, I want to talk about some of the digital archives the University of Suffolk has available. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to review the archives that you have available. Specifically, I want to highlight overall content, date of coverage, and suggest subject uses for the archives. As we go through, if you do have questions, please use the chat feature and my colleague Amy will be able to share those questions. So as a trainer, I'd like to set expectations and just help you understand desired outcomes. So there are 3 session objectives. The first is just to raise awareness of your historical digital archives. The second is to heighten your knowledge of what's inside the archives. So you might be aware of some of the archive, some of the content, but not exactly what's inside the archive. So I'll hope to heighten your knowledge of what's available. And then the last one is really just to help you understand how the archives can be used to support your studies. So the university has 4 Gale digital archives: 17th and 18th century Burney collection newspapers, 19th century UK periodicals, British Library newspapers, and the Times Digital Archive. So let's start with Burney. So Reverend Charles Burney came from a very wealthy family. He is the son of a music historian. He's a schoolmaster. He was a schoolmaster. He was the headmaster of his own school. He was a classical scholar. He was ordained in the Church of England. You may be familiar with his sister, Frances Burney, who's a writer. So he came from a very wealthy family, and his pride and joy was collecting books. At the time of his death, they found 13,000 printed books in his house. This represents the largest single collection of 17th and 18th century English news media available anywhere. The titles range in date from 1603 to the early 1800s. And you might be able to think about Times Digital or British Library newspapers, and you might be aware that those came after this. So you can see that Burney collection will provide you with some unique content prior to the development of Times Digital or British Library newspapers. So his collection is one of the most comprehensive collection of early English newspapers. Here you will find titles from England, Ireland, Scotland, the British Isles, but you also find content from the colonies. So there's content on America, the Caribbean, countries in Africa, and certainly Asia. Specifically, you'll find content on Hong Kong, Singapore, Kenya, Barbados, Jamaica. So if you're looking for specific unique content, you will be able to find a lot of that in Burney. His content really focuses on newspapers, but there's also news pamphlets, there are news books. He has acts of parliament, he has broadsides, and he has proclamations. So you have a variety of different content types. So here you can see it will support all forms of historical research. Specific themes I want to highlight. First is political history. So whether you're studying things relative to the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, the Treaty of Paris, which ended the 7-Year War, or the attacks on George III and his ministers. Literary history. Burney has collection related to some unique literary works of female writers of the 18th century. So there are poems, there are essays, there are substantial works on females of the 18th century, but also he has sermons. He has some really unique printed sermons. History of trade. So whether we're looking at trade represented in ads, whether we're looking at book trade that's documented through ads, whether it's published books, book dates, prices, forthcoming books, you'll find quite a lot related to the history of trade. The history of the press. So nowadays we get a lot of our coverage of news, maybe on social media, maybe on watching the television, but you'll find the history of the press in terms of the development of the concept of news in Bernie. So we're talking about the newspapers, we're talking about the free press. History of advertising. So advertising as a developing genre. So he will cover, some information on disparate topics like medicine, goods to be sold, people and property to be sold, not just as slaves, but as runaway servants. Wasn't easy to change your employer in the 17th, 18th century. So people often who were working ran away. Also lost or stolen personal effects. I wouldn't think now that if you lost anything of value, you would think to put it in the newspaper, but that's how they got information out to people. So you'll find really interesting things related to items that were, or personal effects that were lost, and it was advertised in the paper for return. History of the theater. So whether we're looking at theater adverse, whether we're looking at criticisms of the repertoire, as well as gossip about the players. And quite often that told you a lot more about what people thought than the actual play itself. And then history of individuals. So a rich source of information about people, very useful for family as well as social historians, because he covers genealogy information, but also individual men, women, and children of every social standing. So whether they're aristocrats or tradesmen, doctors or entrepreneurs, morally improving or amusing anecdotes are covered and discussed in a surprising way. All right, then we go to the 19th century UK periodicals. Britain was one of the world's first industrial urban superpowers. So this looks at, the way they had to feed the demands of an increasing literate population in the 19th century. Content here comes mainly from repositories of the British Library, National Library of Scotland, South Africa, and Australia. So you can see it's quite diverse. But 19th century UK periodicals is a multi-series archive. The University of Suffolk has part 1. This covers events, lives, values, and themes that shape the British Empire. So very few of the materials in this collection has ever been reissued in any format. So using this content, you are sure to be including something unique and original in your dissertation or in your research on specific subjects. Part 1, as I said, it looks at events on and values and themes of the British Empire. So we're looking at marking the beginning of commercial lifestyle publishing. We're looking at the rise of the modern magazine culture. This is published, aimed and tailored to a variety of different audiences, but a particular focus on rarely documented aspects of women and children. But it also looks at humor and leisure activity in the Victorian age. They didn't have all of the opportunities for leisure activity, so it's quite interesting to see how they entertain themselves, and you can see quite a lot of that documented in this archive. The other thing it looks at is sort of, it acts as a barometer of literacy and social mobility. So again, looking at the value and the culture of the British Empire in the 19th century. The collection falls into a range of disciplines. So from art to business, from children's studies to politics, you look at things relative to literature, whether it's merchandising, women's studies, nursing, religious studies, world history, and also sociology. So you can see there's a range of different disciplines that this archive will support. A few of the more specific content, 2 publications that are widely cited in 19th century journals, Boy's Own and the Floricultural Review, if you're interested in that. So this looks at political spectrum of women's writing. There's also Hearth and Home, and also a suffrage paper, again, looking at insight into the changing status of women. So again, remember that this part 1, looks at women, children, leisure activity. So there's quite a lot of focus on women, their roles, their status, and how that continued to change and develop in the 19th century. Other titles range from satire and comic. So there's one called Judy, which looks at comic cuts. It sort of is a rival to Punch, the satirical newspaper. And then there's one called Figaro in London, which is really a children's entertainment and education paper. It really looks at sports, hobbies, comedy, things like that. Some specific content in terms of politics, you've got the Northern Star, you've got the Penny Satirist. One that nowadays is uniquely placed is something called the Shield, the Contagious Disease Association Weekly Circular. And I don't know that it has a lot to do with virus. It really focuses on women's issues. It's a feminist paper focusing on women's issues. But one of the big things for this circular was that there was a campaign that it really tried to focus on, the campaign against prostitution. So again, women's issues, they wanted the right to do what they wanted with their own bodies, and it started emerging in the Shield. Rural Life is a country gentleman paper. I imagine something Mr. Darcy would be approving of. Children's literature, so there are literature journals related to young children, girls, Union Jack, Tales for British Boys, and then a Tiny Tots for very little people. For leisure, you can look at ladies' fashionable content. You can look at monthly magazine of sport. There's one called the Fishing Gazette, which my husband will probably be very interested in. And then there's one called Walter's Theatrical and Sporting Directory. Again, think that they didn't have all of the options for entertainment that we have today, but you can see how they entertain themselves by looking at these periodicals. And then in terms of humor, which everyone needs, there's the Tomahawk, which is a Saturday journal of satire. There's one out of Birmingham called the Owl, which looks at wit and wisdom. And then there's one called Funny Folks, which is a weekly sort of budget periodical looking at funny images and jokes and stories, as well as notes. So these are some of the variety of things that you'll find in Series 1. All right, we come to British Library newspaper. This is the most comprehensive range of regional and local newspapers printed in Britain from the 18th to the 20th centuries. So we're looking at range from early tabloids to radical newspapers covering all regions of the country. And this is important because unlike some of the newspaper archives, this covers the entire country. So it's not just the London paper, you have regional English newspapers. You also have newspapers from Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So anyone living in Cardiff will really appreciate the opportunity to have a paper in Welsh. If you're in Northern Ireland, you want something unique to your local region. And similarly, if you're in Glasgow or Edinburgh or any part of Scotland, it's really important for you to have local content. And British Library Newspapers delivers that. It covers history, but also literature, sociology, economics, religion, politics. It covers a range of subjects specific to the British Isles. Just some of the different types of newspapers you see here, and I've highlighted just a few. So Brighton to Bristol, and as I mentioned, there are Welsh newspapers as well. And then papers from the north, you can see from Hull all the way, you've got Leeds and Manchester and Liverpool. So if you're looking for something unique to specific regions of the United Kingdom, British Library Newspapers allows you that. And with the archives, you can search by region to specifically tailor what you're looking for, or search by a specific newspaper and then just go through that. All right, the last one is the Times Digital Archives. This is your newspaper of record, your full digitized version of the actual paper. The Times is considered the newspaper of record because it's the oldest daily newspaper in continuous publication. So there are newspapers sort of like Burney that is started before, but it no longer exists. And even later on, newspapers came and they no longer exist. But the Times has continuously published, starting with the issue in 1785. And here you have in-depth objective coverage of world events. Newspapers provided firsthand eyewitness account of history as it happened, as it unfolded. So unlike the things that might be in standard history books, and sometimes by the time the books are printed, that information is no longer accurate. Newspapers were different. They're firsthand eyewitness account of history as it was unfolding. So you have the opportunity to see and read how people felt at the time. What were their main concerns? What were their fears? What did they not concern themselves with, even though now we know in hindsight those were big deals? So that's how you can review the newspaper and think about how they felt at the time. So newspapers in the 19th century, it wasn't just a record of the important or the famous. It did include articles about ordinary citizens. So I've highlighted this particular article about the NHS because of what's happening now. I tend to watch Question Time every week because I like to know what the British people think. And rarely does there go a month without some discussion about the NHS. So I can see from looking at the Times Digital, there's always been a discussion about the NHS. So, you know, this article talked about cuts to the NHS, and nothing has changed in the 21st century. But notable inclusions in the newspaper, obviously you have genealogy, but one thing with that is sometimes if there was a slow news day, you might find marriage announcements or death announcements that were huge articles. So for example, if the vicar's daughter married the school teacher's son, that would be a sort of a big news event for that town or that city. So sometimes you might find little gems in the genealogy about people and marriages. Other things notably in inclusion in newspapers: recent arrivals to or departures from a town of ordinary people, names of individuals staying in homes, hotels, rooming houses, land purchases. I know in some countries, if you are trying to buy a piece of land, they have to publish that in the paper and clear the title sometimes for 90 days. And that might still happen in several places. So land purchases might be noted. But the opening and closing of local businesses, the change in ownership of a local business, that was also often published in the newspaper. So that's how they would let people know if Mr. Smith no longer owns that butcher shop, or, you know, Mrs. Jones has opened a sewing or a knitting shop. You know, that's how they let people know what was going on in the town or the city or the village, is including things like that in the newspaper. So you'll be able to find little gems in the newspaper that you may not have thought about before. So what disciplines will the newspaper support? Quite a few. So the first one, science and technology. Within the Times, you can chart the invention of the telephone, home appliances, mobile phone. Geopolitics. So whether we're looking at the Russian Revolution, the creation of Israel, the rise of global terrorism, it's covered in the newspaper. Certainly war, you know, the newspapers, you know, war will be something of a global event. It doesn't matter how far away you are from the actual fighting and combat. It's a global event. The newspapers cover this. So whether we're talking about the Crimean War, any of the world wars, Vietnam, the collapse of Yugoslavia, or the war in Afghanistan, these are covered in the newspaper. Disasters, again, they tend to affect millions of people. So whether we're talking about the Titanic sinking, the San Francisco earthquake, the Rwandan genocide, or, you know, a tsunami in Asia, these things are covered within the newspapers. Politics. So again, whether we're looking at civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, the Thatcher years, or the Reagan administration, politics is covered heavily in newspapers. So within these, you can find information about a movement or an individual that led it, or individuals who became casualties of those movements. Sport. So sport consistently becomes something that all nations can participate in. If you think about the Olympic Games, if you think about things like the Ashes, that's so historic. So sports events are covered, but also controversial sports stories, whether we're talking about Lance Armstrong or Bannister's sub 4 mile run, or we're talking about Ben Johnson, who was doing illegal drugs. So sports and controversial sports stories are covered. Economics. So again, it affects a large amount of people. If we're talking about the Industrial Revolution or the Great Depression or the South Sea Bubble, these tend to make headline news and they're discussed heavily in newspapers. Business. It's quite interesting to see the rise of Microsoft and Apple. So taking it from when it was an idea and whether or not those who presented those ideas were rebuffed, what people thought about it, and then trace those ideas and those individuals and those editorials and opinions 10 years further down the road and 20 years further down the road. And you can see the changing attitudes and the shift in sentiment from whence these ideas started becoming, developing. Also think about the dot-com bubble. So business is covered, and with the times, there are also business segments and stock tables. If you are looking at specific business news, look at the stock tables, because again, you can look at what was the Apple stock when it started and what is it worth now? What was the Microsoft stock or the Google stock when those companies started? What are they worth now? How have they changed over the decades? And then culture. So culture, again, sometimes binds us together. So whether we're talking about literature, Trial of Oscar Wilde, when we're talking about music, whether it's Elvis Presley or Jimi Hendrix, whether we're talking about hip hop music, whether we're talking about cinema or art, culture is represented in the newspaper. Quite often, they used to print plays for people to be able to entertain themselves if they couldn't afford to go to the theater. So culture is also heavily represented. So those are just some of the disciplines that you may not have thought the newspaper would be able to provide information on. So what do you have access to? The complete coverage of every page, fully searchable from 1785. So that's all the news articles, editorials and opinion pages. As I said, that's a good way to understand how people felt about things. It's almost like question time in print. Business news and stock tables, genealogy, arts and entertainment and reviews. So not just sometimes the play, but what people thought about it, the reviews of the play. If you are studying literature, what's sometimes important is look at the reviews, see what they thought about it then. Fast forward 50 years or 75 years or 100 years, see what people think of it now. So it's just looking at changes in ideas and changes in people's thinking over time about something. Sport, but display and classified adverts. And in terms of classified ads, it also talks about our shift in attitudes culturally. So here I've got a few ads. The first one, health assertions. Quite interesting how they were presented. This was in 1939, as you can see here. It talks about a quicker working brain and a new energy will be the benefits. So this is the benefits of, is it smoking? Is it benefits of gin? Is it the benefit of whiskey? These are just some of the ads, and I don't think any medical professional or the NHS now will suggest any of those in order to provide benefits and energy to the brain. But here, the one below that in 2007, now you have a medical warning against smoking. So look at how the shift has occurred in 25 years. It's probably more than 25 years, sorry. Look at the shift in just the time frame there from 1939 to 2008. The one immediately across from that, gender roles and stereotypes. So this one is 1939, and it's talking about gold flake. This is sort of women, what they like. The caption here, for men, read and women chat. The solution of the problem is to hand over the cigarettes. And then 1966, it talks about Be a Devil, you know, Smirnoff, and how that becomes part of the party. And below that, 2005, you can see image of branding and sport. Now it's quite commonplace to use a beautiful lady, well dressed and enjoying herself to advertise things. And it's not just advertising things to other women, advertises things to men. So you can see using newspaper ads, various clips of how our attitudes have changed. And this can be done looking at newspapers. All right. So that's just a look at the 4 newspapers that the University of Suffolk has available. Again, 17th and 18th century Burney collection, 19th century UK periodicals, British Library newspapers, and the Times Digital. All right, thank you.